Welcome to Dr. Donald J. Wheeler's Understanding Statistical Process Control Seminar. This video is an excerpt from class number 1149 held in September 2021. As part of this class, references are made to various books by Dr. Wheeler. Students are encouraged to have these books on hand when going through this video course. These books are Understanding Variation, The Key to Managing Chaos, Understanding SPC, 3rd edition, SPC Workbook, 2022 edition, Reducing Production Costs, and the softcover edition of EMP3, Evaluating the Measurement Process. These textbooks provide additional coverage on the seminar topics, and the SPC workbook is essential for participation in the many exercises and examples that facilitate learning by doing. This class was taught over a period of 4 days. Day 1 consists of 4 sessions which cover the concepts and computations of SPC. Day 2 consists of 4 sessions which cover the foundations of SPC and some common myths about SPC. Day 3 consists of 4 sessions that show how to use process behavior charts for continual improvement, how to avoid capability confusion, how to pick projects whose payback will justify the effort, and how to chart different types of data. Day 4 consists of 3 sessions which cover methods for evaluating the measurement process. Additionally, these sessions provide practice in applying the techniques covered in the first 3 days. Dr. Donald J. Wheeler is a consulting statistician who worked with Dr. W. Edwards Deming for over 20 years. He's a fellow of both the American Statistical Association and the American Society for Quality. After 12 years as a professor of statistics at the University of Tennessee, he began to teach data analysis techniques in industry. Since 1982, he has conducted over 1,100 seminars for over 350 organizations in 17 countries on 6 continents. Through his seminars, books, and articles, he has had a profound impact on companies and organizations around the world. Dr. Wheeler welcomes your questions at the address on the screen. If you have unanswered questions at the end of the session, you are encouraged to write to Dr. Wheeler, tell him what session you've just watched, and ask your questions. Sessions 1 and 2 will cover the management overview contained in Understanding Variation, The Key to Managing Chaos. Now, let us join Dr. Wheeler and the class.
So understanding variation, the key to managing chaos, will be where we begin. So page 1, understanding variation. Data are random and miscellaneous. Therein lies the rub. We've got tons of data, but we're not sure what they mean. The U.S. trade deficit for February was $11.4 billion, read the headline. Now, what did that mean? Well, that's $1.4 billion larger than the deficit in January. Things must be getting worse. Oh, no. That's $1.6 billion smaller than it was last February. Things are getting better. The problem with both of these comparisons is that they're both correct, but they're both limited in nature. No comparison between two values can be global. Simple comparisons between the current value and some previous value cannot capture and convey the behavior of any time series. Yet how do we typically interpret our data? We compare them to last month. We compare them to the same month last year, and all of these comparisons are neatly packaged in the monthly report, a piece of computer printout reduced down to a size too small for anybody over the age of 45 to read without the aid of their bifocals. Make it small enough and the boss won't ask any questions. Now, managing a company by means of the monthly report is like trying to drive a car by watching the yellow line in the rearview mirror. Not recommended. And when it comes to sports, how do we treat our data? Prior to 1998, who had the record for the most home runs in a single season? Well, Roger Maris had 61 home runs in 1961. Well, why is there an asterisk next to that record? Well, the asterisk is there to note that Roger played more games than Babe Ruth did when he hit 60 home runs in 1927. Oh, okay. Then who held the record, Roger or Babe? Well, that's simple. Roger did. They removed the asterisk in 1990. And why'd they do that? Well, by 1990, all of the supporters of Babe Ruth had died out. Some data have to age, don't you know? Well, isn't there a better way to compare records? Well, we could put all the data in a table. You have it there in the book on page 6. Got that memorized yet? Your brain is not a digital processor. We do not readily absorb tables of numbers. You want to understand a table of numbers, you need to use a graph. And the two basic graphs are the time series and the histogram. Page 7 and 8. In this case, I like the histogram because it shows at a glance that Babe Ruth's 60 home runs was the high point of a consistently good career. And any way you look at it, Roger Maris's 61 was a bit of an exception, wasn't it? Now, I'm old enough to remember the 1961 season, and I was rooting for Roger's teammate, Mickey Mantle. So here we have on page 9 the running record of the number of home runs per season for Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris side by side. Now, what do you notice about these two running records? Every year, without fail, they go up or down together, don't they? Everybody hit a lot of home runs in 1961. It was not a good year for pitchers. And Roger won the race. Now, whether or not you care anything about baseball or sports, what have I done here? I've taken an isolated number, and by putting it in a couple of graphs, I have placed that number in context. And by placing it in context, I have made it more comprehensible. And that is the first principle for understanding data on page 13. No data have meaning apart from their context. Context informs our interpretation of the data. It informs the way we analyze the data. It is the foundation for understanding our data. Now, on page 12 and 13 are a couple of principles given to us by Walter Shewhart. Walter Shewhart was a physicist who worked for Western Electric and later for Bell Labs when that was formed. And he is the man who invented the technique we're going to be studying. And in his first book, he had a couple of rules for presenting data. The first of these rules is data should always be presented in such a way that preserves the evidence in the data for all the predictions that might be made from the data. You see, the purpose of collecting and using data in our jobs is in order to make predictions. And Shewhart is focused on how do we do that. The second rule, whenever an average, whenever a range, whenever a histogram is used to summarize the data, the summary should not mislead the user into taking any action the user would not take if the data were presented as a time series. See, most of what we teach you in your stat class averages, ranges, histograms, standard deviations, and the like, completely ignore the time order sequence of the data. But there's important information contained in the time order sequence of your data. And Shewhart says we're going to use the time series as our basic graph. Occasionally we will supplement that with a histogram. And with the time series and a histogram, you've got your two basic graphs. You're going to see most of what's going on in the data. The Shewhart is focused on understanding our data and using them to make predictions. Data are random and miscellaneous, but knowledge is orderly and cumulative. Page 15. One day, my mentor, David Chambers, went into the office of the president of the shoe company, and he was intrigued because there on the wall, the president had this graph, the daily percentage of defective pairs. And it was right up to date. That's the first thing you look at. Is it current? And it was. So David asked the president, why do you have this graph on the wall? And the president responded, well, I have it up there so I can tell how we're doing. So David shot back, well, tell me how you're doing. No one had had the audacity to ask the president that. So the president kind of stopped for a minute, looked at it. Well, some days are better than others. This is the some days are better than others graph. Do you have any of those around? I bet you do. Here are the data in context. But context is not enough. We need a method for analyzing the data. Page 16. You need the context, but you also need a method of analysis. In between the data and the interpretation of those data, there will always be some form of analysis. Now, that analysis might be something as simple as the specification value approach. That's an unacceptable number. Or it could be something as simple as, well, that's above average compared to the historical average. We're going to take these two simple approaches to analysis and compare them with the process behavior chart approach. So we will begin with comparisons to the specifications. I don't care what you call them, plans, goals, budgets, targets, are all specifications. The current value is judged to be acceptable or unacceptable based on a comparison with the plan, the goal, the budget, or the target. The whole concept comes right out of manufacturing. And the inevitable outcome is a binary world view. You're always either doing okay or else you are in trouble. Now, as long as you're doing okay, sit back and relax, don't worry, be happy. Let things take care of themselves. But when you get to be in trouble, don't just sit there stupid, do something. So you are continually experiencing alternating periods of benign neglect and intense panic. Sound familiar? This on again, off again approach is the complete antithesis of continual improvement. Now, in all fairness, there are different types of management specifications. There are some specifications that are facts of life, things known to be true, not a matter of opinion. Many of you work in corporations that are for profit. And that's a fact of life. Then there are figures needed for planning, things like budgets. These are unsuitable as targets. They really should be used only for guidance and help. But by far the biggest category of management specifications turns out to be arbitrary numerical targets. Lightning strikes from the sky, zap, this far and no further. That's what came down from Mount Olympus, and we need to deal with that. So how are we going to meet this arbitrary numerical target? Well, there are three ways. Page 20. You can work to improve the system. Listen to the voice of the process. Understand how the inputs affect the outcomes. Change the inputs or change the system to achieve the desired results. Unfortunately, this will require sustained effort, constancy of purpose, and an environment where continual improvement is the operating philosophy. Well, that takes too much time. What else can we do? Well, number two, you can distort the system. Listen to the voice of the boss, understand how to beat the system, change the blame to someone else. All you need here is an acute sense of how much you can get away with. And then there's the third option, distort the data. Listen to the voice of the boss, understand how to dissemble effectively, change the message. This is especially effective when your organization is numerically naive. I've seen situations where this was done in a very sophisticated way, with which it was just simply an organized way the accounting department was lying to upper management. You see, the specification approach does not provide any insight into how the process works. Specifications are at best the voice of the customer. They should never be confused with the voice of the process. Comparing values to specifications will not lead to the improvement of the process. But when a current value is compared with an arbitrary numerical target, then the binary worldview, which is a consequence of the specification approach, will kick in and will create a temptation to make the data look favorable. So specifications will tell you where you are, as in you are in trouble. But it will not tell you how you got to be in trouble, nor will it tell you how to get out of trouble. The specification approach may be useful with facts of life. It may be useful with figures needed for planning. But when we start using it with arbitrary numerical targets, it's just a game. Well, what about comparison to average? Well, we're going to be above average about half the time. We're going to be below average about half the time. Well, duh. What'd you expect? You see, both of these traditional approaches to interpreting data depend upon the comparison of two single values, or the computation of a percent difference. And that's a limited comparison. Different comparisons can yield contradictory results. The comparison of a value with an arbitrary numerical target may allow somebody to assign blame, but it does nothing to remedy the situation. Comparisons with average values let you feel good half the time, but they make you feel bad half the time. So take a Prozac and wait till next month, maybe the numbers will get better. Page 23. In contrast to all of this, we have Schuhart's approach to interpreting data. When we analyze our data, we want to know if a change has occurred in our process. But you see, the numbers can change even when the process remains unchanged. So, are the numbers changing because the process is changing? Or are the numbers changing even though the process has remained the same? To answer these questions, we need to make a distinction between routine variation and exceptional variation. Routine variation is the name we give to that run-of-the-mill variation which is present in every process. Even an unchanging process will display routine variation. Exceptional variation is the name we give to those values that fall outside the bounds of routine variation. By its very nature, exceptional variation is interpreted as a signal that the process has changed. So to separate the routine variation from the exceptional variation, Walter Shewhart created the process behavior chart. The process behavior chart is the voice of the process. It begins with your data arranged in time order sequence. We add a central line as a visual reference for detecting trends or shifts. Then the limits are computed from the data themselves and are placed symmetrically on either side of the central line. When I say that, I'm reminded of the first time they put a chart together at a meeting at the hospital at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And they explained that the lines here represented the voice of the process. This was just the routine variation. And then they asked if there were any questions. And the four-star general in the front row had a question. Who authorized those limits? That's when they got to explain to the general that a higher authority had set these limits. It's the voice of the process. You compute the limits from the data, and the data don't care how many stars you've got on your shoulder. It's the voice of the process. Learn to live with it or start getting busy fixing it, changing it, improving it, hopefully. The limits on a process behavior chart are calculated in such a way and placed at that location where they will filter out virtually all of the routine variation. Therefore, any points that fall outside these limits can be interpreted as signals of exceptional variation. Any points that fall out by separating the routine variation from the exceptional variation, the process behavior chart allows us to determine when a change has occurred in our process. And detecting changes in our process is the reason that you analyze your data in the first place. So the process behavior chart could be called the has a change occurred chart. When a point falls outside the limits, it is taken as a signal that the process has changed. Moreover, this change is large enough that it will be worth your while to discover what caused the change. As long as your process continues to display exceptional variation, it will be unpredictable. So it will be to your advantage to discover the assignable causes of the process changes indicated by the exceptional variation. So another name for the process behavior chart could be a when to fix it chart. But when a process behavior chart shows nothing but routine variation, it gives you a basis for making predictions. With nothing but routine variation, your process is going to look like it's unchanging and predictable. When this happens, the past can be used as a reasonable guide to the future. A process that has been predictable in the past is likely to continue to operate predictably or be operated predictably in the future. A process that has been operated unpredictably in the past is likely to remain unpredictable in the future. The essence of management is prediction, and prediction requires knowledge. Explanation does not. We can always find an explanation after the fact. But you know good and well, half the time, it's just make-believe. The scary thing is when you make it up and then you believe it. Now, we're going to shift gears here a little bit. I want to ask you to turn in the Understanding Variation book to page 125. It's helpful to make a distinction between three different types of action. Because when we say take action, that means different things to different people. So, specifications, plans, goals, budgets, targets are for taking action on the process outcomes. To separate the acceptable outcomes from the unacceptable outcomes after the fact. The voice of the customer. Process behavior charts are for taking action on the process. To look for assignable causes of exceptional variation when they are present, with an eye toward process improvement in the future. And to refrain from looking for assignable causes when they are absent. Your process behavior charts are the voice of the process. Now, when we have the voice of the customer and the voice of the process, actions to align the two voices are appropriate. While this has been tried in the past, the lack of a well-defined voice of the process has made alignment difficult to achieve. You can't steer the car when the suspension is out of whack. You try to, but it goes one way and then it goes the other way. An unpredictable process means that you're not in control of the process. You're not being able to hold it steady. And that is very frustrating when you try to get the voice of the process aligned with the voice of the customer. So let's characterize predictable and unpredictable processes. Page 126. When a process is operated predictably, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, it's going to look the same. The variation in the process outcomes will be essentially the same day after day, week after week, month after month. When a process is operated predictably, we can find natural process limits that bracket virtually all of the routine process variation. These limits may be considered to be the voice of the process. They define what a process is going to produce. Now, if the voice of the process is not properly aligned with the voice of the customer, some fraction of the process outcomes will be non-conforming. While the observed fraction non-conforming may vary from day to day, the basic level of non-conformity will persist from month to month. So when a process is operated predictably, all of the process outcomes are the result of the common causes of routine variation. The same routine variation that gave you the good product is also giving you the bad product. And in this situation, seeking a special explanation for the existence of the unacceptable outcomes will be a waste of time. Why do we have all this bad stuff? Because the voice of the process is not properly aligned with the voice of the customer. So when a process is operated predictably, the only way to tackle the problem of unacceptable outcomes is to bring the two voices into alignment. Either shift the process aim or reduce the process variation or change the specs. One guy said that means finding new customers. Well, it may be. But I have seen the political problem of changing the specs handled by process behavior chart. So when a process is operated predictably, the outcomes will vary within the natural process limits without regard to the specifications. I don't care what your process is. Your process doesn't know the specs. You can shout it from the top of the highest mountain. Your process has no ears. But what happens if you're not operating your process predictably? Well, page 130. An unpredictable process will display both routine variation and exceptional variation. By definition, the exceptional variation, which is due to assignable causes, will dominate the routine variation due to common causes. Here's some data from a plant in Scotland. There are 32 examples in this book. They're all real. I've had to change the names in a few cases to keep me out of trouble, but the data, the stories are all real stories. Well, these data came from a plant in Scotland. You got Monday, you got Tuesday, you got Wednesday. You want to be there on Thursday and Friday? Might be good days to call in sick. I used up all my sick days, so I called in dead. So don't blame me, I wasn't there. I wouldn't make up data this horrible, but I don't have to. When a process is unpredictable, the process behavior chart will detect the presence of assignable causes. A point outside the limits is evidence of an assignable cause. Each and every such signal on a process behavior chart represents an opportunity to learn more about your process. And this idea goes all the way back to Aristotle. Aristotle taught us the time to discover the causes that affect your system is to look at those points where the system changes. And this is what the process behavior chart does for us. It gives you a way to say a change has occurred. Find out why. There's something we can learn here. The process behavior chart is constructed so it will be economical to spend the time to identify the assignable causes associated with points outside the limits. The process is different, and it is different enough that it will be worthwhile to find out why. It's simple. It really is this simple. When a process is operated unpredictably, the process outcomes will vary without regard for either the natural process limits or the specification limits. Oh, well, that's what we made today. Tomorrow is always another day. Maybe it'll be better. Possibly it'll be worse. Now, with that background, let's return to page 25 and see what we can learn from the data for the daily percentage of defective pairs. No points fall outside the limits shown. No long-term trends visible on the graph. No long sequences of points above or below the central line. Unless this process is changed in some fundamental way, we can count on it to continue to produce anywhere from 7% to 30% defective each day, while averaging 19% defective month in and month out. So what would I predict for January? I'd be an idiot to predict anything other than 19% defective. The process is operating consistently. The process is predictable. The quality level is completely unacceptable. We make 5 pairs of shoes to get 4 we can sell, and 1 we can ship to the outlet mall. So what about the president's interpretation of these data? 37 days were worse than average, 30 days were better than average, and that's about right. But the process behavior chart shows no evidence of any changes during the past 67 days. While some days appeared to be better than others, both the good days and the bad days came from the same process. Do you see the change in emphasis here? The specification approach and the average value approach attempt to place a meaning on each and every value. In contrast to this, the process behavior chart describes the behavior of the underlying process and gives us a basis for predicting what may be expected in the future. On page 29, while the specification approach and the average value approach ignore the effects of variation. The process behavior chart explicitly makes allowance for the effects of variation. You see, variation is that random and miscellaneous component that undermines all simple and limited comparisons. And that brings us to the second principle for understanding data on page 30. While every data set contains the noise of routine variation, some data sets also contain signals of exceptional variation. Before you can detect a signal within any given data set, you must first filter out the noise. The process behavior chart filters out the noise of routine variation by the construction of the limits. Signals of exceptional variation are indicated by points which fall outside the limits or by recurring patterns of variation within the limits. This distinction between the signals of exceptional variation and the noise of routine variation is the foundation of every meaningful analysis of data. It also defines the two mistakes that we can make when we go to interpret our data. Mistake number one is interpreting noise as if that noise amounted to a signal. Mistake number two is failing to detect a signal when it is present. Now, we can have a perfect record with respect to mistake number two. Really simple. Interpret everything as a signal. That way you'll never miss a signal, but you sure will make a lot of mistake number one. The number goes up, that's a signal. The number goes down, that's a signal. The number stays the same, and that's a signal too, because we expected it to go up or down, you know. Sounds like a stock analyst, doesn't it? The trick is to filter out the noise so you can detect the real signals. And the process behavior chart strikes a balance between the economic consequences of these two mistakes. Well, data are random and miscellaneous. Knowledge is orderly and cumulative. And the purpose of analysis is insight. You're not going to analyze the data for fun. You analyze the data to gain insight. So, how do you read the monthly report? What do you look for? How does your manager decide what question to ask? Most people go right down the percent difference column, looking for large, unfavorable percent differences. First-time approvals for Department 12 are down 23%. In-process inventory for Department 17 is up 42%. On-time closing of accounts in Department 6 is down 22%. Now that we have our three contestants, the meeting today will begin with a discussion of the problems of in-process inventory in Department 17. Music to your ears if you're not in Department 17. So there you spread out and start looking at all the rest of the numbers in that row. The July value of 28 is an all-time high, bad. 42% above plan, bad. 12% above last July, bad. Year to date is 10% above plan, bad. 6% above last year, bad. All the bad numbers line up in a row. You just won the jackpot. You get to write a report. What are you going to say in that report? We had 28 in July because. And you're going to come up with some explanation. But does the value of 28 represent a signal? How would you know? So in Understanding Variation, between page 37 and page 42, I take you through step by step how to create a process behavior chart for individual values. This is the simplest of all the charts, and it's probably the most broadly applicable. We'll deal with that this afternoon. Right now, I want to skip to the final result on page 42. You have two parts to the chart. There's the X chart, which shows the data in their time order sequence. And there's the moving range portion. Now, the moving ranges are the differences between successive values. And the moving ranges are used as the means of calculating the limits. And they have an upper limit as well. We'll talk about what that tells us as we go on. So we have the in-process data here for Department 17. No points fall outside the limits. No long sequences above the central line or below the central line, 8, 9, 10 in a row. No evidence of unpredictable behavior. We have to conclude this process is operating as consistently as possible. Now, what are you going to say about that? What's your boss going to say about that? Well, right off the bat, if this process is averaging 20, which it is, then the daily values can bounce around between 9 and 30, 31, or maybe 32, not 31. So the monthly values may range anywhere from 9 to 31. And the next question is, can't we hold the values any tighter than that? No, you can't. The natural month-to-month variation guarantees that the monthly values can bounce around from 9 to 31. Oh, that's terrible. How can we improve things? Well, if we got a process that's being operated predictably, the only way to improve things, so to speak, is to change the system. Asking why you had 28 in July is just a waste of time. You had 28 in July because you're going to be above 20 half the time. It's just routine variation, signifying nothing. Well, we can find an explanation for that, yep. And your explanation for why you had 28 in July will have one unavoidable consequence. It will lower the corporate IQ. Because as soon as you have an explanation for why you had 28 in July, somebody's going to believe it. And the sad thing is when you believe it yourself. On-time shipments. Who doesn't even need extra deodorant for the monthly meeting? The manager of Department 20 just sits in the back corner and takes a nap. He never gets asked to explain his data. Nothing to get excited about here. Or is there? How would you know? Using year 2 as a basis for constructing the limits, we get the chart shown on page 46, 47. We have 6 individual values and 1 range outside the limits. These limits make allowance for routine variation. And making allowance for routine variation, we still have too much variation in this time series. The points outside the limits are exceptional. The process is trying to tell you that it has a problem. You may have already missed 3 opportunities to improve the process. How many more opportunities are you going to miss? If you concentrate on the percent differences, you're unlikely to ever be aware of this problem until you wake up one morning and find that you have lost a large account due to late delivery. Process behavior charts are the way to listen to your process. They allow you to detect signals you would otherwise miss. And premium freight. The general manager asked for a breakdown on the use of premium freight. This was a large assembly operation, so materials were shipped in. They had several thousand shipments each month, and they're using a lot of premium freight. Why do you think the general manager asked for an explanation on the use of premium freight? It's easier to see on page 48 than here on the screen. What happened the last 3 months? They've gone into double digits, haven't they? When you go past the power of 10, the numbers physically get bigger, and that always looks like a signal, whether it is or not. In this case, it is. Well, who got to write the report? Well, the transportation manager. He came to me. I said, let's put the data on a chart. So we did. Went back a couple of years. And we just took 1 year. 1 year is a convenient length of time. 2 years is better if you got it. But we started with year 1, and I just, wait, time out. What happened in May of year 1? Because clearly something changed. See, a big range down here on the moving range chart identifies this jump up here as a break in the time series. So there was a change between April and May in year 1. So the transportation manager kind of scratched his head and said, May of year 1. That's about the time we called all the purchasing agents into one room and gave them new guidelines on when to use premium freight. Now, with a service function like purchasing, a new set of guidelines is a new system. They changed the system in May. So, are these the right limits to use? Let me ask the question differently. Do these limits represent the old system? No. Do they represent the new system? No. When you have a definite and known change in the process, you have to respect that piece of information. That's part of the context. So in this case, I throw out the first 4 data points, the first 4 moving ranges, and recompute the limits to characterize the new system following the new set of guidelines. You've got to pick your baseline according to your context. It's got to make sense. Well, how'd they do? Page 52. Well, October of year 2, if that point had been anywhere above the average, we would have had 8 in a row above the average, which in and of itself is considered a signal. But by the time we got there, they're outside the limits. But I think this, you don't just interpret the point outside the limits. You go back to the last time you crossed the central line. And that's the run in which things may have changed. This gives you a broader horizon. The way I interpret this, you've got an assembly operation and they're screaming for parts. And you don't ship the parts, you don't get the parts in, then you shut down the assembly operation. And that's not a good deal. And so we start seeing management by exception and people ignoring the guidelines and get the parts, get the parts, get the parts, pressure from the production side to the supply side. And then in May of year 3, there was another change, wasn't there? Through the big range, jump. So the general manager asked the right question, but he should have been asking the question 10 months earlier. So what's the difference? In-process inventories. Manager assumed that large percent differences must represent signals. No signals were present. Mistake 1 was made by the manager. He wasted time. He wasted resources. He wasted emotional energy asking people to explain noise. On-time shipments. Manager ignored small percent differences. Signals were missed. Mistake 2 was made by the manager. The opportunity for improvement was missed. And premium freight. The process behavior chart was used retroactively. Traditional analyses had missed the signals which were clearly shown by the chart. The general manager finally asked the right question only after the problem got too big to ignore. So what's the difference between the traditional approach based on limited comparison and the process behavior chart? Just the difference between superstition and knowledge. Process behavior charts are the beginning of knowledge because they help you to ask the right question. Nothing else even comes close.